Welcome to the EpicureanFriends.com book review of A Few Days in Athens, a story about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Please keep in mind that A Few Days in Athens is fictional, and the author is giving you her own interpretation of Epicurus. In a few cases, she deviates from Epicurus's own views fairly dramatically, but when we get to those, we'll point them out to you clearly. Even more, keep in mind that the participants you're about to hear are giving their own opinions. There are many different interpretations of Epicurus, and we hope this book review will prompt you to study Epicurus for yourself. For those who want to read more about Epicurus, the book we recommend the most is Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We also invite you to join us for discussion at the EpicureanFriends.com forum and to listen to our companion podcast, Lucretius Today, which is available at all major podcast sources. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy this session, so let's join it now. Tonight we're going through chapter 11, the chapter in which Epicurus and Theon talk among themselves after the long discussion of Epicurean philosophy last week. And then they observe that the sky is changing and there's a storm approaching. And the latter part of the chapter is occupied by a person on a horse who's coming towards them, but is about to get washed away in a torrential stream. And Epicurus and Theon debate how to deal with that and eventually take care of it. But the first part of the chapter is devoted to a discussion between Epicurus and Theon about, it seems to me that this is apparently aimed at people who are, and I think Stoics are substantially want to do this kind of thing. They're concerned about immortality of their reputation. They're concerned about how the greatness of their achievements might be lost to future generations. And one of the things that Theon starts talking about is that it's such a tragedy that people who really are virtuous and wise are frequently forgotten, but those who are basically criminals or other deviants of some kind are the ones who are more often remembered. And Epicurus responds to Theon that it's in fact the wise men of the world do in fact appreciate former wise men, even if the great majority of them are not wise, and the great majority worships at the feet of people who are more famous for not virtuous. And then there's another discussion of prejudice, which has sort of been there in several of the past chapters, with Theon saying that he hates prejudice and he can't stop from being angry with people who are that way. And of course, it would probably be worth saying that in the context of what we're talking about, we're not talking probably just about racial prejudice or something like that, but we're talking about religious prejudice and just narrow-mindedness in general, probably. And Epicurus continues to take the position that anger is not the best response to prejudice, that by allowing yourself to become angry, you commit some of the same sins of those that you're mad at. So there's further discussion of the issue of anger there. And then just to finish up the outline of what the chapter is going to be about, the two of them gather under a portico of a building and observe that this person is galloping a horse toward them. And this is one of the interesting facets of the book. They've added a new character here, this Hadiya, Hedeia, who is represented to be sort of an adopted daughter of Epicurus, someone who I think begins to represent in the book almost a character that embodies pleasure in many different aspects. In fact, when I was preparing for tonight and reading forward through several chapters, I believe it's the next chapter in which I think it's a lot of interesting material in there about Hadiya and a lot of repartee between them in the next chapter, in which Hadiya, I'll be very interested in people's reactions to what she's saying about herself. She's a very headstrong, very aggressive, very self-confident woman in all of her embodiment of her beauty and her intelligence and her wittiness. Is a very interesting and very aggressive presentation of someone who's like that. But at any rate, in this chapter, she is on her way back from having visited a sect of Pythagoreans. And she just happens to be coming back during the storm, and her horse, she's riding through the stream that has, because of the storm, become very tumultuous and torrential. And she's threatened with being swept away, killed, drowned in the stream. And the final part of the chapter is devoted to Theon and Epicurus talking among themselves about what they should do. Theon wanting to go ahead and rush into the stream after her to save her, and Epicurus holding him back for some period of time. But with the final result being that Theon goes into the stream and largely saves her. But the point of the chapter is that even he, in pulling her back over to the bank, is about to be swept under as his own strength is waning. And Epicurus then himself jumps into the stream at the last moment and pulls them both out, with the implication, presumably, that this is an illustration of this point that you don't act rashly, you don't act precipitously before the time is ripe, but that when the time is ripe, you need to act aggressively, which is the statement from Seneca that we talked about. And if Joshua were here, he'd be able to tell us that there's some connection between this and perhaps an incident that took place in the life of William Short in Europe, but unfortunately, I don't know those details like Joshua does. But that is the sequence of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But okay, so Scott, I guess it's going to be me and you sort of debating or discussing the high points here for posterity's sake, unless Joshua arrives, and Kevin is not with us tonight, so it'll be just us.
Yeah, interesting. I with you, along with you, I wonder at the extent to which it is discussed. Posterity, being immortalized and remembered by others and so forth. Why is that an issue here? Is it the Stoics that were big on that? And I don't know. I mean, I've read some of Stoicism, but I don't know enough to know for sure. What was said about that, and so I hesitate to think that's the reason. I mean, oftentimes in this book, of course, the Stoics are sort of one of the major evils, others. But do you have any hint about any specific evidence that is the case for Stoicism, that it's a big deal that you live your life in such a way that you're remembered as a virtuous person or something?
I'm close to saying that there are good examples of that, but more accurately, I would say that it seems like that there was a lot of interest among the rich and famous gathering that there was in the ancient world. Didn't they have these family shrines as well, where they would have a little of the people in the family? And I forget, there were some Latin names for the layers or something like that. I don't want to overemphasize this part of it, because I guess it's kind of tied into the issue of not just immortality for the sake of, it's really tied in with this issue of virtue and why you're, because a lot of what they're talking about here is how the wise men of the earth are not as often remembered as the ones who do famous deeds that are more related to action or enterprise. I'm looking at different things right now, like military leaders. They're the ones who seem to win the fame. Maybe this whole thing is a sort of a subset of fame in the first place.
Yeah, it's funny. For one thing, though, it doesn't really seem to be true. I mean, we have, like your Dillinger, who's, Billy the Kid. There's some sort of, rebel heroes and so forth that we make movies about and so forth. But, at the time of the Greeks and Romans, certainly they would make busts of, great philosophers and things like that. They wouldn't of criminals and so forth, like might happen today, where you have this, Robin Hood sort of those kind of heroes. So doesn't it ring a little bit funny to you that Theon would claim this to be the case?
Yeah, the whole section here, it doesn't go with the second part of the chapter. Maybe it's almost like it's more of an extension of the last chapter. It also seems to be tied into this issue. Theon expresses that he's really not satisfied with the answer that he's getting. Theon says, "Your words sink deep into my soul, yet they have not chased the melancholy they found there." He doesn't have it in himself to be independent of the world around him or forgive the offenses merely because they commit them from ignorance. And so they blend the discussion here to discussing the issue of whether these people who are famous for maybe ill deeds are ignorant or just malicious. I think the conclusion goes back to the statement that he hates prejudice. and he's provoked by it, and he's concerned about what is the proper response to observing it in other people. And Frances Wright has Epicurus say that allowing yourself to be provoked at the evil of other people will not remove that evil, and that you should be, I guess the whole thing is moving towards being slow to anger, I guess.
What do you think about, Cassius, about, do we see these kinds of expressions in the ancient material? Because for me, when I read through this part, I'm like, I don't really remember picking that up. But again, that just could be not enough exposure on my part.
Well, I think that Frances Wright is pretty close here to the general consensus of what Epicurus's views were. But this would be another place to pull out again the Philodemus material on anger, because it is recorded in the Philodemus material that the Epicureans did believe in a certain kind of anger, not rage, not an emotion kind that makes you lose your faculties and do rash or unintelligent things. But there is specific discussion in Philodemus about when it is possible to take action to deter bad events from occurring. It's just natural that you can and should do that. So it's more a distinction between rage, which gets control of you and takes over, versus prudent action in response to some negative condition. Scott, you've got all sorts of different philosophical influences that have informed some of the things you're saying. What would you say is the distinction there? Is all anger, by definition, something that's inappropriate, or is it appropriate to have a negative emotion to a negative circumstance?
Yeah, good question. So let me bounce back to Buddhism once again, because this is a topic that resonates very well with a lot of the material, the teachings in there. The Dalai Lama himself is on the record for saying, even though that Buddhism, as everybody knows, is such a pacifist, don't hurt anybody, don't harm a thing kind of religious expression, the Dalai Lama has said there is a place for anger. There is a time when anger might help us, because if we don't ever feel indignant, anger can help inspire us. It can help move us to take good actions. But you're right that rage and anger in general are negative. They shut down those parts of our brain that allow us to think clearly and make good, intelligent decisions. And of course, you can hear these kinds of teachings in various philosophical and religious expressions. But when I read this section, I had to note how much similarity I was seeing in modern Mahayana Buddhist expression. So that was just interesting to me. For what it's worth, I mean, and also I would say that there's a distinction made, and it's made very clear in Buddhism, and I think I feel that here also, that there's a distinction between what you do, your behavior, and what you have going on inside of your psyche, inside of your emotions and so forth. And rage and anger inside of you are different than what you have to do on the outside. It may be, for instance, that you become enraged and you kill someone. That's a classic example of how rage sometimes causes things to be done that otherwise would not have happened and are very destructive. But it can also be that a person can very much control their rage, but they know, this guy, I know what he's going to do. I have evidence that what he's going to do. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to kill him, because at the end of the day, that is the best thing for me and for everyone here, even though it's bad for this one person. That's something that your actions are different than, I mean to make a very clear distinction between those two, between the rage and what one does. Mm-hmm. So certainly controlling your rage, not letting it have the reins of the horse, not letting it be in charge of everything, is a good thing. I would think that's being expressed here. And that I see also in Buddhism. But what you do, you might have allow anger to give you some inspiration to spur you on. But basically, yes, it should not be a driving force. And I'm pleased to see that is clearly expressed here. That's a pet impediment to your wisdom and choosing the best thing for you.
Well, I'm looking at the closing of this aspect of the argument and how it transitions into the discussion of the storm and rescuing Hadiya. I suppose it could be interesting to consider whether she is linking these two things together in her own mind, because obviously what she's about to introduce in the last part of the chapter here is a very active response to a threat that is about to wash away someone who's extremely valuable to these people here. And maybe there's a point to be made that even though you're not going to get angry at the storm, you still need to take strong action to deal with the consequences of the storm. And perhaps you just say the same thing about other people. It doesn't help you to become enraged at what the storm is about to do, because the storm isn't going to be affected by your rage in any way. But if your emotion moves you to action, as you're saying a moment ago, Scott, then it's a good thing. A motivating
It can actually
force.
be helpful. Yeah. And I think Epicurean recognizes that openly, says that is the case. It's not like anger, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not like anger is something that's seen as some sort of a horrible sin in Epicureanism. No, it's not a desired characteristic, but there's a time and a place for that too, where it's justified and correct, I believe, right?
Right. It is clearly stated in Diogenes Laertius in the section where he lists a lot of attributes of the wise person, that the wise man is going to feel emotion more deeply than another person will, but that is not a hindrance to his wisdom, is what the line says. Yeah. So I think that's exactly in line here, is that the emotions that you feel are in many cases, maybe it's the nature of emotions, that they're natural to have them. You're going to naturally feel certain things in certain circumstances. And in contrast to the example of the Ayn Rand group, there's a famous line in Rand that emotions are not tools of cognition. But I think that almost the opposite is what Epicurus is saying here, is that you do need to listen to your emotions and not let them control you. But certainly they're providing you some important information about something. And if you just try to suppress them or ignore them, that's probably worse than not listening to them at all. Yeah. The whole issue of suppressing emotion is something that has a lot of interesting implications to it. And people accuse the Stoics of doing that, which that's a significant distinction between Epicurus and the Stoics there.
Yeah, repression, I agree. That's definitely that's the bad guy, that we don't want repression of emotions. And I wondered, are you saying that is the way that the Stoics approach them?
Very few people would use the word repression and embrace that word, I think, but that's the kind of word you see people when attempting to describe what the Stoics are really saying, because the Stoics are seeing pleasure. The feelings of emotions are things that are to be looked on with great suspicion by every Stoic writer that I've heard anybody describe.
Yeah. At one point during the reading here, I felt like this was Stoicism almost. Epicurus is talking and he says, "Have I not been trying to show you that when you are wise, you will be independent of all that you cannot command within yourself?"
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. Yeah. Yeah. I thought that tended a little bit too far as well, because you may be wise, but she's just discussed in the last chapter that when you have a friend who dies before you do, you're going to be deeply affected by that. And there's just no way to avoid that emotional trauma, basically, of seeing the friend die. You may be wise, but you're still not independent in that sense. Depending on how it's written there, you can qualify what she's saying and make it make sense. But I too thought that skirted a little close to...
And there's an interesting, it can get kind of nuanced there, because, what does it mean to be independent of something that you cannot command within yourself? Because it could be that, this doesn't contradict at all what was in the previous chapter, because I truly love my friend. It is horrible that I've lost my friend, and I allow that experience to be expressed and to come out in me. I allow that emotion to fully express itself. That doesn't mean that I have not been able to command that, because when I have a reaction that is inappropriate, I feel it's unwise, it's not appropriate, I should have the ability to command within myself that I will keep independent of that, and I will not let that run the show, sort of. Would you say, it seems like independence could be, expressed that way, that it's the option, in other words, of going with your feelings. And we've talked about this in a different way before too, where we're talking about, you have to have your judging things on the basis of pleasure, coupled with some brain power, some wisdom. You don't just follow instantly every urge that you get, because then, you're just letting your lowest urges or whatever just drive the show minute by minute. And you're not going to maximize your pleasure and enjoyment in life if you do that. So you do need to have some sort of a ability to, provide a commanding structure there. And I know I'm the one now crossing over into dangerous territory.
What I hear you saying is you're echoing what Epicurus said in the letter to Menicius about free will and how terrible determinism would be. I mean, even though pain and pleasure are things that we sense, and in a sense, nature gives it to us without, nature gives it to us automatically. But nature doesn't require us to follow pleasure every moment or to avoid pain every moment. It gives us the ability to decide which of the pleasures to pursue and which of the pains to avoid and under what circumstances. So if Epicurus had not been so strong on free will, he'd really have that problem you're talking about, because we would really be slaves of pain and pleasure, which we're not. I'm trying to think quickly whether I've seen any passage that would lend itself to that accusation, but there's really not any in the Epicurean material that I'm familiar with about that would allege that you must follow pleasure or avoid pain. It's always stated clearly that there are times when you're not going to do that. Pleasure and pain are guides, but they're not dictators. They're not masters. You have the ability to use prudence in pursuing them.
Yeah. So that was the part of the summum bonum conversation that we got into for a while there too.
Yeah.
The pleasures are not summum bonum exactly, but they are the target. They are what we're going after, but that doesn't mean that you just foolishly do everything that hits your whim.
Right. Well, one more thing I want to be sure to include in tonight's presentation is, we talked about it in the past, but there is one of Seneca's letters, book 1, letter 22, in which he refers to Epicurus's letter to Idomeneus. And I'm not sure that letter survives, and this is probably the only part that we have of it. But the quote that we have a graphic that Ellie made of it, we've referenced it several times, but the quote from Seneca is that, quote, "You will attempt something only when you can attempt it in appropriate circumstances and in the appropriate opportunity. But when comes the right opportunity, you be ready to grab it. When contemplating fleeing, it is prohibited to stay empty-handed. There's a hope for a way out even in the most difficult situations, if not in too great a hurry before time, nor dilatory when the time arrives." It's kind of weird. I have no clue as to what Seneca is talking about there, or what prompted that, or what Epicurus would have been talking about. But the relationship of that quote from Seneca seems to me to be too close to be coincidence in what Frances Wright is working on here with this final episode, because that's what Epicurus and Theon are kind of talking about to each other. Theon wants to rush out. Epicurus is holding him back. And then after they succeed in the rescue, it's because Epicurus has acted at precisely the right moment to save the day, when he could not have done it himself alone, but by waiting until Theon had done much of the work but was about to fail, the two of them combined their efforts in a successful result. Like I say, it's kind of interesting. I don't know why Epicurus was talking about something like that, or if there's a philosophical position there. I'm not sure if there's a philosophical implication to that or not, or whether it's just something that was recorded that happened to survive. But that's what they do here at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, something that's funny too, and I don't know what you made of this, but when they first spotted this rider coming across in their direction, they did not recognize the person, is my understanding.
Right.
They couldn't tell who this was. And so Epicurus is saying, don't be rash. The horse is strong. The rider appears skillful. And Theon noticed, however, that Epicurus' voice had changed, that he was definitely concerned about this situation. But if I understand correctly, the next words are out of Epicurus' mouth, and he says, "Do you know her? Is she your friend? Is she dear to you? If so..."
Now that is Theon talking to Epicurus, I'm pretty sure, Scott. Because at this point in the book, Theon has had no connection with Hadiya at all to know who she was to Epicurus at all. That's the implication there, I think, is that Epicurus did recognize her first, but he was not explaining to Theon who she was.
Not yet. You're right. I hadn't mentioned it. The right. Just okay. Then then I'll just forget that. I'm going the wrong direction there.
But clearly, Theon was agitated, even though Epicurus knew who it was, and Theon did not. I guess this is an example of Theon's youth and energy and so forth. And in contrast to Epicurus's concern, which is showing in his face, and yet maybe a more prudent approach to it to wait until the proper time to see if they were going to get across.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know anything about whether Hadiya is really a character that's in any of the texts or not. It does provide an interesting setting for some discussions that will take place in the next two chapters. It sounds like you've not read further along, Scott? Or
I
have you?
haven't, and that's right. And I've been kind of busy, so I was only able to read this one time. So normally I like to read a chapter
Right.
a couple of times, so I really can say something about it. But yeah, I don't know what's coming yet, so no spoilers, right?
Well, I will not spoil it, but I'm going to be particularly interested in your reaction next week because the next chapter does focus on discussing not only the Pythagoreans, which is a significant part of it, but like I say, one of the more interesting aspects of the next chapter and Hadiya for the rest of the book here is going to be how she is very, I use the word aggressive or headstrong or self-assured, self-confident, almost to the point that it's not exactly off-putting, but the other characters, as we're going to discuss next week, kind of have this very debate with her that you are so headstrong and you are so confident of your attractiveness and so forth that it's going to be an interesting discussion, I think. So I'll be interested in your opinions there.
Mhm.
So let's see if there's anything else in this chapter to go over.
There's not
Scott, anything in general about your impressions of the book so far?
not that I haven't really already said. I mean, the last two
Yeah.
chapters were really great, and there was a lot to work with there. Very, very interesting. This one, it doesn't have so much. Overall, I am impressed. There's a lot of good stuff here in this book. I wasn't sure whether there'd be, anything worth much. And as we all know, we can't take for granted that it's an accurate representation of Epicurus or Epicureanism, and it's one person's perspective. But obviously, it's an intelligent woman that's writing this, and insightful, and somebody who's well exposed to this material, however much that exposure could be from some of the friends that she kept, but also her own reading and so forth. It's really an interesting romp, and it makes also the philosophy come alive, because it's one thing to read, instructional texts and philosophy manuals and so forth, and another thing to have this fiction, which makes the people become real, and they're struggling with real human problems in a real world, and so I'm enjoying that part. I think it's fun.
Okay. Well, then why don't we go ahead and wrap up our recorded session for tonight here. I'm looking at the last sentences to see if there's anything else in the very last. The very final sentence was Epicurus stating to Theon, "I watched your strength, my son, and reserved mine till it should fail. When I observed it to do so, I came to your assistance. And now compose yourself a while and we'll go put on a dry tunic." That's the explanation for this, and it just seems to fit exactly into that passage from Seneca. So why don't we wrap it up there for this evening, and we will see each other next week.